3, 2, 1.
Hey guys, welcome back again. So today we will talk about the history of aircraft carriers. I'll try to keep it short, it won't be too long. Hope you guys enjoy. Thank you for watching. Now, it all started off with balloon carriers, and these were just ships with a balloon tethered to them. They were used to perform reconnaissance on enemy positions and not much more. They were actually used once by the Austrian Navy, where they launched a number of balloons carrying small 24-pound bombs from the SMS Volcano, and it was then attempted to have these balloons drop the bombs on the city of Venice. However, the wind changed and many of them flew back over Austrian lines, and some even hit the SMS Volcano. During the American Civil War, the Union Army had several coal barges completely stripped of any deck fitting to allow them to tether observation balloons. This resulted in the first successful aerial reconnaissance missions ever done. These balloon carriers were also used during World War I, however they were not very seaworthy and thus had to stay in low waters throughout their lifetimes. However, with the introduction of seaplanes in 1910 by the French Henri Fabre, these balloon carriers were all deemed outdated, as it was now possible to create seaplane carriers. The first seaplane carrier was the French Foundre, which could carry 4 seaplanes. She was only used for naval exercises and never saw any aerial combat. The first seaplane carrier to ever launch a successful combat raid was the Japanese Wakamiya, which launched 4 Maurice Farman seaplanes, whom bombarded German forces in the city of Tsingtao in 1914. A short while after, on the Western Front, the British Navy had sent an impressive squadron of 3 seaplane carriers along with an escort off the shore of Heligoland Bight. The seaplane carriers launched 12 seaplanes, which attempted to bomb a Zeppelin base at Cuxhaven. Fog, bad weather conditions, and anti-air fire left the raid mostly unsuccessful. However, the raid still forced Germany to relocate their high seas fleet, and it showed the potential of ship-borne aircraft attacks. Now, before we had full flat-deck carriers, we had the HMS Furious. Originally a battle cruiser, she had all her turrets removed in order to install new flat decks and hangars. These modifications, however, proved not to be very successful, as the bridge superstructure was not removed, which made the 2 decks very short. Her funnel and superstructure caused too much turbulence for most landings to succeed, and only 3 successful landings happened before the superstructure was removed. In 1921, she was converted into a full aircraft carrier with a continuous deck, allowing for successful landings and takeoffs. She went on to serve in the Second World War as well. Before her conversion, she did however lead the first ever carrier-borne aircraft attack, where 7 South-Myth Camels successfully bombed a German Zeppelin base in Tonder. Prior to the beginning of the Second World War, the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt was concerned with the fact that they had no new carriers that would be done any earlier than 1944. A new concept was made, and several Cleveland-class cruisers were turned into fast aircraft carriers. These carriers could only carry 40 aircraft, whilst the normal fleet carriers could carry as many as 75. However, they were fast enough to keep up with normal fleet carriers, where escort carriers could not. Those carriers would later get the term of light aircraft carriers. Another class of carriers that was introduced during World War II was merchant aircraft carriers, and these were first introduced by the British to protect Atlantic convoys. For this purpose, former merchant ships had a flight deck added to allow them to operate anti-submarine aircraft whilst protecting friendly convoys. These could carry as many as 6 aircraft and operated with their regular civilian crews. Therefore, they still had their normal cargo underneath the flight deck. Most of these carriers were not fitted with hangars or lift for aircraft due to their small size and the restricted amount of time that was given to their conversion. Therefore, the aircraft had to stay on the flight deck throughout any sea voyages. These were eventually made obsolete with the introduction of escort carriers. Escort carriers were a third of the size of normal fleet carriers and could only carry around 20 to 30 aircraft, most of which were for anti-submarine warfare. Other than defending convoys, these were mostly used for transporting aircraft across the ocean to land-based airfields. During World War II, aircraft carriers played a significant role as they provided aerial superiority for the Allies in the Mediterranean and eventually also in the Pacific. Even though Italy and Germany both had aircraft carriers under construction, none were ever laid down and only Allied carriers were used in the European theater. However, in the Pacific, the Japanese had a big advantage against the Allies as they already had 10 aircraft carriers at the outbreak of war, whereas the Americans only had 7. The first ever carrier battle, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, showed the dominance of aircraft carriers in naval battles. The carrier forces of the two sides engaged in consecutive airstrikes for over 2 days. Both sides lost a carrier, and the American fleet had another carrier critically damaged as they were forced to retreat. Both sides called it a victory, but the losses on each side were severe. A very interesting little design during World War II was the invention of submarine aircraft carriers, like the Surkurf or the Japanese I-400. The Japanese I-400 submarines were able to carry 3 aircraft, and they performed the only aerial bombing of the US during World War II. As you know, World War II brought with it the development of jet fighters. This resulted in aircraft carriers having to adapt to much heavier aircraft, which needed more deck space to both land and take off. Therefore, angled decks and steam catapults were invented. Speaking of angled decks, during World War II, aircraft would land parallel to the landing deck of aircraft carriers, where other aircraft would be parked at the end of the carrier. To avoid collision of planes overshooting and hitting the parked aircraft, a crash barrier was set up. However, the crash barrier only diminished material destruction, as they would cause serious harm to any pilots who overshot, and many times they would not be able to stop airplanes from reaching the parked aircraft. Therefore, a new solution was needed, and in 1950 the Royal Navy tested the theory of an angled deck on the HMS Triumph by painting an angled deck markings for touch-and-go landings. They were also tested on the USS Midway later the same year. The first carrier tested with a fixed angled deck was the American USS Antietam, which proved to be a superior method compared to the original flight deck method. Thereafter, the US Navy installed angled decks on their Essex and Midway class carriers. The first carrier to be constructed and launched with an angled deck was the British HMS Ark Royal, followed in the same year with the also British Majestic class light aircraft carrier. The steam aircraft catapult was first invented by Commander C.C. Mitchell of the British Navy as a method of launching the much heavier next generation aircraft after World War II. On HMS Perseus, a steam-based system was tested which proved its effectiveness, as it turned out to be much more effective than the old hydraulic catapult system which had been introduced in the 1940s. The next big invention was the use of nuclear reactors on sea-going vessels. The first ever carrier to be powered by a nuclear reactor was the USS Enterprise. This allowed it to operate for very long intervals without refueling, and all of the new Gerald R. Ford class aircraft carriers are to be built with nuclear reactors. The French Charles de Gaulle is the only non-American nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. However, there are plans to build a second of its class. Post-war, we also saw the development of the helicopter, which brought with it a variety of new uses. Whereas fixed-wing aircraft are suited for air-to-air combat and surface bombing, helicopters can be used to transport personnel, equipment, and are very good in anti-submarine warfare. Thus, in the early 1960s, the British and the US Navies both converted some of their older carriers into helicopter carriers. LPH, short for landing platform helicopters like the HMS Bulwark, were introduced. These new helicopter carriers usually have shorter decks, as they don't need to have a platform for aircraft to take off and land on. However, with the introduction of vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, these helicopter carriers were also able to carry fixed-wing aircraft like the Sea Harrier. Later on, helicopter carriers designed purely for amphibious troop transport were developed, and these are named landing helicopter docks. These ships still have the ability to carry helicopters for aerial support, but usually also carry landing craft which can depart through an opening in the back. This means that they can be much smaller than classic carriers, and even small navies like for example the Algerian Navy have one in service. The aircraft carrier is undoubtedly the king of the seas. However, how long it will stay this way is unsure with the development of supersonic missiles and railguns. Thanks again for watching, I really hope you enjoyed.